afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Avani Abha, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I extend a warm welcome to all to today's ICS panel discussion titled 20th Russia-India-China Trilateral Academic Conference 2025. The 20th RIC Trilateral Academic Conference took place in Beijing from November 18 to 19 this year. These academic exchanges began in Moscow in September 2001, bringing scholars from the Institute of China and Contemporary Asia in Russia, China Institute of International Studies in Beijing, and the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Supported by the government of the three countries, the conference has since taken place annually in each capital on rotation, helping strengthen mutual understanding and build shared perspectives. This year's conference, titled RIC Cooperation in an Era of Century-Defining Transformation. This panel discussion will feature presentations by the members of the ICS delegation to this conference, which will encompass their own papers as well as their assessments of the outcomes of this conference. The panelists for today's seminar are Professor Alka Acharya, Professor Anuradha Chinoy, Ambassador Ashok Kanta, and Dr. Arvind Yelleri. Professor Chinoy is a former professor and dean at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and an adjunct professor at the School of International Studies, Jindal Global University, Sonipat. Ambassador Ashok Kanta has served as India's ambassador to China. He is currently an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies and a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation. Dr. Arvind Yelleri is an associate professor at JNU and an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. The moderator for today's seminar is Professor Alka Acharya. She is a former professor and chairperson at the Center for East Asian Studies, JNU, and the director of ICS, New Delhi. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Avni, for that introduction. And without further ado, let's get down to the discussion here because we have four people and we would really like to, through this panel discussion, convey to you a certain historical process that the Institute of Chinese Studies has been involved in, namely the Trilateral Russia-India-China academic conferences. Now, as was told by the introducer, these conferences now have for 2 decades facilitated and promoted an open and objective exchange of ideas among scholars and practitioners from all the 3 countries. We have raised and discussed over the last 2 decades international, regional, political, security, economic, scientific and technological and cultural issues of significance, not just to the 3 countries, but to the world. It would take too much time to go into the background, genesis of this dialogue. Suffice it here to say that this initiated from the understanding that these 3 countries had historically not just been mere nation states or states, but civilizational states comprising 1/5 of the humanity. And as we move along, increasingly occupying a very, very prominent place on the political and economic landscape, internationally and regionally as well. The 2 points that are invariably reiterated at all these meetings has been that to view the dialogue of the scholars and practitioners from the 3 countries as a reflection of the thinking of the policymakers is really not quite accurate because we are witness to a certain discourse that is taking place, unfolding at this point, where the Russia, India, China interactions are seen as some kind of a geopolitical move to create an alternate pole or to somehow engage in the balance of power politics at a time when there is a momentous transformation taking place in the world. And the scholars from all the three countries have actually made it a very significant part of their approach to this academic dialogue, that this is not intended as an alliance, that we are not really working towards promoting an alliance or trying to look at the emerging configuration in terms of confrontations, or that this is targeted at any third country. But given the significance of these three countries politically, economically, in human resource terms, uh, uh, an exchange of ideas as to how the three countries can cooperate at this time of transition will contribute towards not just regional dynamics, but also to global peace and development. And in terms of really thinking ahead as to how uh, international politics is being shaped or requires to be shaped. I think there is a very significant feeling among the scholars of the three countries, and this has been shared over the past 2 decades, that this trialogue can actually produce very significant outcomes, particularly in terms of the areas of cooperation, because over the last 2 decades, we have covered just about all possible avenues, starting from energy security at one end to space and technology, information technology at the other. And some very interesting and far reaching ideas have come up. The second point I'm going to mention before I request Ambassador Counts to come in, that in all these dialogues, the focus has always been on thinking in terms of possible collaboration and cooperation, which can be transmitted to the three governments for consideration. And we have seen over the years that these scholarly exercises have indeed contributed to the policymakers. 2001, when these conferences started, was followed actually in pretty short time, if you think of it, in 2005 by a decision for the foreign ministers to meet. And the following decade, it appeared as if the track one was overtaking track two in terms of uh, the, the, the kind of ideas that were being debated at the level of the foreign ministers. Post pandemic, of course, things have been going a bit uh, sort of less coordinated fashion, but the scholars have kept this dialogue going. Now, the title of this 20th academic conference was RIC Cooperation in an Era of Century Defining Transformation. And the 2 points that really encompassed or constituted the kind of background in which we were debating, and this was in fact the first offline conference, or this was second actually. Last year it was held in Moscow, and this time the 19th was held in Moscow and 20th. So we are hoping that the practice of offline conferences by the among the scholars has commenced in right earnest. But two factors which were actually driving the entire dialogue and discussion. One was the feeling that this was an age of the emergence of multipolarity and multipolar order in a far more different sense since the end of the bipolar order. And this trends towards multipolarity and multilateralism were an arena of possible convergence between the three countries, and scholars were actually exploring the ways in which uh, India, China, and Russia uh, could come together to think about how we should actually be working towards shaping this emerging multipolar order, particularly at a time of great turbulence. The second was the rise of the global south and the institutions that are fast emerging among the global South countries, and what is the role that India, China, Russia can play in terms of providing some leadership, providing guidance, uh, pushing these platforms on more broader and broader kind of scale, and eventually working towards the kind of, or at least working towards building the kind of ideas that are required for the 21st century, a time of great challenge. This was the backdrop, and in this kind of a backdrop, we had basically three sessions. The first session, in which Ambassador Kant made a presentation, was RIC Cooperation amid global volatility and century-defining transition. The second session was on the RIC's role in driving multilateral cooperation and regional integration, where Professor Anuradha Chinoy made a presentation. And the third session was advancing practical cooperation under the RIC framework, where Dr. Yellery made a presentation. Now, I'm going to request each of the three participants in this discussion to come in for about 6 to 7 minutes and give us a sense of what their main arguments were in this conference and what they made of the kind of discussions that followed from the papers that were presented in their respective sessions. So Ambassador Kanta, over to you first.
Thank you, Alka. Am I audible? I seem to be facing some problem. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Oh, okay. Well, Alka has already set the stage for discussions. Before I come to contents of 20th edition of RIC Academic Conference, let me highlight a couple of points. One, that this track 2 or track 1.5 dialogue, which started in 2001, has been surprisingly consistent. Even the COVID pandemic didn't quite disrupt it, though for a couple of years it moved into virtual mode. So since 2001, there have been as many. This was the 20th meeting, and now we have agreed to have 21st meeting next year in India. Second point is that unlike other platforms where China today is very keen to sort of project itself as the leader, in case of RIC, one can see a distinct willingness or even alacrity on part of China to give full credit to Russia for initiating the RIC process and now reviving it. So references were made to the very important role played by academician Primakov, who was Russia's foreign minister, later prime minister, and he proposed Russia, India, China Trilateral framework way back in December 1998 during a visit to India. At that time, it was emphasized as a kind of strategic Eurasian triangle to counter US unipolar movement, particularly after NATO's Kosovo intervention. But since then, the nature of dialogue and its focus has changed somewhat, as Alka brought out. This time, we didn't see any effort being made to project RIC, platform as a kind of Russia, India, China troika. Also, in terms of initiative, what we noticed that when it comes to road ahead, though China was the host, ordinarily it should have taken the lead. It was the Russian delegation, especially Professor Kiriev Babaev, who is director of Institute of China and Contemporary Asia of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He proposed a couple of things and indicated that Russia will be happy to lead that process. One, that they will be preparing a report of 20th meeting, and two, they also were prepared to have intersessional activities that Alka referred to. So Russian, sort of centrality in the process came across quite clearly. From our side, the basic messaging was that we don't quite look at it as any kind of troika. We will believe that it has to be advanced on the basis of mutual respect for sovereignty, equality, empathy for each other's interests, sensitivities, and aspirations, and recognition that we all have agency and pursue independent foreign policy and adherence to international norms, making it very clear that it was not directed against any common, front, or it was not a common front against any country. And this point, at least pro forma's sake, was endorsed by both China and Russia. So we sought to keep the focus on converting the dialogue into some modest but concrete deliverables which we could recommend to our governments. And these could be, relatively narrowly defined, time-bound pilots that produce visible results rather than declaratory rhetoric. Because this is a recognition that RIC has been underperforming in terms of its outcomes, in terms of its visibility. If we wish to change that, we need to come up with some outcomes which are realistic yet visible. Now, coming to the current global context, here again, while there was broad agreement that we are living through turbulent times, there was no consensus on the nature of turbulence and what needs to be done. This reflects the fact that there is lack of strategic convergence among three countries, which limits the role and utility of RIC as a platform. And also, the fact which has been noticed and highlighted in earlier editions of RIC Track 1.5 dialogue, that Russia, India, China relationship, if it's a triangular engagement, one arm is relatively short and feeble. That is India-China relations. Whereas India had good relations with Russia, and likewise China has good relations with Russia. India and China, state of the relationship, which has deteriorated, especially since 2020. This leads to inability of three countries to combine and come up with practical issue-based cooperations. Now, in terms of world in transition, as Alka mentioned, there is recognition that the unipolar moment is definitely behind us, but full-fledged multipolarity has not yet been established. So that we are trending towards multipolarity. All three countries agreed on need for a greater focus on multilateralization. But here again, how to arrive at that destination, there was no consensus. The issue of G2, which has come to the fore following US President Donald Trump's comments just before his meeting with President Xi Jinping in Busan, was discussed at some length. And here, China disavowed itself of any interest in pursuing a G2 agenda. And we also made it clear that G2 is not something consistent with requirements of multipolarity or even a realistic proposition. Uh, there was, a discussion on nature of multipolarity. Uh, China talks about multipolar world, but clearly they are not interested in multipolar Asia. Though, this time, unlike some other conversations, their views were not expressed so bluntly as to suggest that they cannot be multipolar Asia, because there is essentially only one major power. If you exclude US and consider it as a non-resident power. On specific issues like, you know, progress towards better global governance, clearly there wasn't much traction on issues like multilateral reforms, including restructuring of UN system. There was shared interest in cooperation in health security, energy stability, climate adaptation. These were considered as practical or low politics starting points. But we didn't quite discuss any specific projects and initiatives at the 20th edition. So, what was agreed that while there is a recognition and acknowledgement on part of all three countries that RIC provides a valuable forum which should be continued. Uh, there was no clear understanding that we must recommend a resumption at the level of foreign ministers. As Alka mentioned, foreign ministers track or summit track is currently in abeyance. Both Russia and China were very keen that we should convene an early meeting at the level of foreign ministers. We thought it's not really for us to get into that. It's for foreign ministers to decide when they wish to meet, and they are in touch with each other all the time. So, in closing, let me mention that. Uh, Finally, it boils down to coming up with some practical propositions and ideas which are realistic. So we suggested that need for a stress test of ideas and recommendations, keeping in mind the fact that we are living through really complex and challenging times, and also, we are not quite on the same page on a whole lot of issues. So Alka suggested, and there was resonance on part of other two leaders, that we could discuss more specific ideas and projects through intersessional, roundtables, which could be organized in the virtual format. And in parallel, as I mentioned earlier, Professor Babayev, leader of Russian delegation, promised that they will come up with a draft report and share with us, which will finalize before the next, the 21st edition. There was keenness on part of three countries to continue the process. We invited others to come to India for 21st edition, and they accepted invitation. So this process will go on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we need to try and see how we keep focus on concrete, but relatively modest practical propositions, practical ideas where we can work together, rather than letting people imagine that this is some kind of strategic troika taking place, which is far from the case. I'll conclude there.
Thank you, Ashok. I think you indeed very, very significantly brought out the fact that the bilateral dynamics have always been a part of this trilateral academic discussion, in the sense that to what extent do bilateral relationships become an obstacle or a promoter of the RIC cooperation. And all the conferences have featured a discussion on the bilateral relationships. However, it's quite obvious and it has been underlined that such issues, which are problems or disputes between two countries, are a matter for them both. But the fact is that this is certainly one of the dimensions. And two, that the balance between the expectations and the possibilities are always there. I mean, scholars have had in the past really conceptualized very, very ambitious schemes for the trilateral cooperation, and some of them have actually fructified. But clearly, this balance between what is doable, what is possible, was very much in the air, partly because it seemed that something needs to be pushed forward rather than perpetually keep staying in the aspirational mode. Anu, can I request you now to make your presentation, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Alka, Ashok, Arvind, and all our young friends. So I think the ambassador Kantha very, summed it up, and I can only make a few additional points. One is under the broad theme, there were many common points, like, the importance of collaboration between think tanks, about the transition, about the need to work for multipolarity, importance of strategic mutual trust. It was not about, that they felt that all three sides felt that this trust, there is something of a trust deficit, obviously, which Ambassador Kantha pointed to. There's a need for people-to-people exchanges, and they also focused, all three, agreed that strategic autonomy is important, that multilateralism is under stress, and multipolarity should have the two adjectives of equal and orderly. That there were points of compatibility also, even though there were differences in the one arm, as pointed by Alka and Ashok. But there was also, all three sides agreed that the US should not be a glue of the RIC, that we're not anti-US, only non-Western. And RIC is not confrontational. Of course, all three were, I think, promoting one or two things, which I just want to outline. So the Chinese delegation very clearly promoted the Global Security Initiative, the BRI, but they also said they were committed to the RIC, and they continuously took the lead from the Xi, Modi, Putin meeting at the SCO conference. So obviously that has filtered down into their ministries and think tanks. And they pointed out about their sensitivities, but they also said that RIC needs a stable architecture and has to speak louder. Now, Russia was clearly promoting the idea of a greater Eurasia. And at a state level, they see RIC should be a caucus within BRICS and actually lead it. And you can see now why Russia is so keen on reviving RICS at multiple levels. So for them, the RIC and BRICS is critical. But there was one thing that the Russians argued, which is similar to what we said, but in different words, which I think the Chinese understood, because several of them repeated this in different ways, in which they said that RIC, meaning China, should not repeat the mistakes of the West and have a hierarchy based on asymmetrical power relations, but on equal relations. So I think we in India also feel that, power relations are never necessarily symmetrical, but that should not lead to unequal relations. So I thought that was an important point. And of course, as far as the Indians were concerned, I think Ambassador Kantha has already put it very clearly, and he said it over there, that RIC has underperformed. We need a multipolar Asia for a multipolar world, and these, and have a small set of deliverables. deliverables. Now, of course, the differences even within the RIC remain. Of course, for China and Russia, both believe that the border issue for India and China should be central and should not be allowed to interrupt other issues like trade, etc. For us in India, we have an approach that the border is central and a major block, and it needs to be first managed well and de-escalated. But Russia-India had the approach that asymmetrical power relations should not lead to hierarchy, but all nodes and centers be treated as equal. And I think Ambassador Kantha made a very important point here in which he said very clearly that even small powers today have agency and have to be treated with equality and dignity. So I thought that was a very clear point within the RIC framework. Now, of course, there were some concrete proposals, which Alka pointed out, of how to improve and give an input. And one of them was to give an input into better public perceptions and create a narrative for the RIC, which a think tank can do. Not completely, but some idea of how the discourse can move. The other interesting concrete proposal was of a young scholars dialogue, and I see so many young scholars here, and I thought that was a great idea if we can push that whenever. People-to-people dialogue would obviously be linked to this young scholars dialogue. And I think many of the other points have been already shared by Alka and Ashok. And I actually support all of them about online meetings, webinars, in-between forums, that RIC come out with a report, but the views of each of the three countries also be separately stated within that report. And I think that's about it that I could see. As far as my paper was concerned, I had a written paper and I can make it available to ICCA, who can either circulate it or put it online on multipolarity. Thank you.
Thanks, Anu. Indeed, we are planning to put out this report on this conference, which will be in the public domain. In addition to what we will be conveying to the ministry in terms of what the scholars have by way of some very useful ideas and suggestions for promoting what is clearly referred to by Anu, also the foundations of a partnership such as this, which is at the level of people. The idea of the RIC or a Russia, China, India combine, not combine in the sense of an alliance, but an idea of a partnership for the benefit and progress of people at large should be something that resonates at the level of the people. I mean, one goes back to the very short-lived, highly idealized Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, which of course never lasted because of its extreme kind of romanticism. On the other hand, we also have the idea of Russia, which resonates a great deal among the people in India. And this is largely to do, and here we come back to the whole civilizational strengths, largely to do with the fact that there are very strong cultural contacts between both India and China and India and Russia. Now, how do we build on these cultural contacts, which clearly can become a very strong pillar of people-to-people exchanges, and how that will then infuse these relationships with more vigor and vitality. So yes, thanks Anu for flagging that out. And Arvind, can I now ask you to make your presentation, please?
Thank you, ma'am, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to my co-panelists again, Ambassador Kant and Anu ma'am. While the other speakers covered some of the critical areas, I thought In this RIC meeting, I wanted to cover something which is of a burning interest for all the sides, and that is the growth. And when we talk about growth, largely it is understood development, largely it is understood trade and investment, but I wanted to take an important aspect, a critical aspect of the growth, which is the availability of capital and the fiscal aspect of the development. And my observations were made in the light, especially when most of us know that how China is struggling, when it comes to the accounting. Most of us know that China has floated the 15th five-year plan, and there is hardly any mention about local government's role. And traditionally, the local government has been spending about 80% of the total government expenditures. Now that amount is staggering. When one looks at the role of the local government. Also, one has to look at the amount of pressure the fiscal transfers is happening between central government and local government in China. I mean, Russia is not exception to this. I mean, Russia's the liquidity portion, what they call it, national wealth fund, which is the key cushion, has significantly dwindled. And keeping that aspect in mind, I thought of taking this important aspect of about finance, because so far most of the cooperation ideas the three countries are talking about are large ideas, are ideas which are broad and macro, but they have been, avoiding the key component is about the fiscal risks. Most of the events, in past 10 years, these three countries have faced two or double risks, actually. One is the fiscal risk domestic, and the fiscal risk which has been pushed by the external factors. In one of my observations, I tried to locate and saying that these three countries are trying to balance between the financial security and financial inclusivity. Though China talks about how it is talking about providing financial securities, providing loans to different countries, but China has its own insecurities and sensitive aspects with regard to financial securities. Russia and India are not different to this. So when we try to look at the major challenges these three countries are facing, and if that has to be converted into cooperation, fiscal financial security turns out to be a major portion of interest. But in the entire discussion, this is apparent to a couple of last discussions I was fortunately part of. China and Russia are not talking about this. I mean, both the sides have been aversive about talking about the financial curse, which they feel that the state is in control, the state can take control of. So when I talk about the financial stability or cooperation between the three countries, I just wanted to provide an optics vis-a-vis what is happening globally, because the financial curve is not only about emitted from the investments and the trade. The most of the financial curves which these three countries are going to face would come from the new technologies, or the transition to the new frontiers of technology, or as these three countries are struggling to find ways to innovate growth, or create infusion, there will be a problem. So for these three countries, if there has to be a cooperation, I mean, even if it is of a very small in proportion, it has to come from dealing with this finance curse, as Nicholas Saxon mentioned in his book. The three countries has to be extremely careful when they are making superlative proposition, especially China and Russia. They have to be careful about the banking stability. They have to be careful about monetary stability, fiscal sustainability, capital market growth. So I wanted to bring these points to the discussion so that there is more, dark side comes in the front, and discussion takes forward. In one of the question and answers, I even raised this matter that the 15th five-year plan is not talking about the role of the local governments or the role of the subnational dynamics, and we didn't get any answer from the speakers from the Chinese side. So now I try to put the financial risk in two broad spectrums. Number one, in past 25 years, major financial risks, the global financial risks and volatilities have been caused by tier one countries. These countries are the countries which have high economic performance, what we call the developed economies. And most of the risk levels were medium to critical, high to critical. That means that most of these fiscal tensions and the risks which were pushed to the emerging economies, and especially to the Russia and India, China, they have come from developed countries. When it comes to the projections in 2025 to 2030, I just went through the major publications of World Bank, IMF, SoftBank, Asian Development Bank. There are more volatilities are yet to come and cause major crisis for countries like Russia and China. And that is not only about growth, investments, or the loans. That has to do with geopolitical fragmentations and conflict with regard to the restrictions. That is also with regard to the climate change or technological transitions. So what does it mean? That the challenges of Russia and China with regard to financial risks are not just going to stabilize but increase over the period of time. And it's a pity that despite of been talking of this format, and in this format, Russia and China has not been explicitly talking on these aspects. The second spectrum I touched upon during my presentation is about the risk aversibilities. Risk aversibilities are the methods through which emerging economies, emerging markets, EMs, and especially the RIC countries can prepare for the risk aversibilities. But it looks like China is preparing for risk aversibilities by circumventing the technological curve or circumventing the innovation curve. India is trying to catch up with that, but Russia is nowhere in sight. So in the end, what we see is that there is a major imbalance between the amount of risk which will be pushed towards the emerging markets and RIC, and at the same time, the risk aversibilities within the RIC is yet to achieve a kind of a maturity, or not even maturity, a kind of a consensus. So that is broadly things were discussed. Couple of things during question and answers and in-person interactions, it was noticed that though this is a academic forum and we try to engage more frankly, there is more substance and content brought to the academic forum from the Indian side, because we have been critical, realistic, and we have been very cautious in making proposition and contemplating over it. And I think that is one of the best factor or a positive side of this format, where the team from India, so far I have been part of a couple of them, have been very wise to make these statements and contemplates over the statements made by the other two sides. And I think that is where we concluded with some aspects which I think Ambassador Professor Kachar and Anu ma'am have brought up. I'll just stop there.
Right. Thanks, Arvind. I think we have, with all these three presentations, I hope, given you a flavor of the overall tone, tenor, direction, and let's say, the inner dynamics that operate very often at these RIC academic conferences. The inner dynamics are conditioned by the fact that whereas on the Russian and the Chinese side, the delegations comprise people who are extremely closely working with the government or maybe part of the government institutions, whereas on the Indian side, this is a research institute which is represented by scholars and former practitioners who therefore impart a very different kind of a flavor to the discussions. The weight of the official discourse is very differently balanced in these conferences. And the second thing which Arvind has brought out, that when it comes to moving away from the broad conceptualization of IR and from the kind of forces that are now shaping the national interests of the countries, the simultaneous push towards moving away from what have clearly been institutions, key governmental international organizations dominated by the West, to a situation which is now being, to a point which is now being increasingly challenged by the newly emerging powers. These dynamics come out very, very clearly, where scholars look at the entire process unfolding in a larger historical tapestry. And in that sense, therefore, the immediacy that drives policy formulation does not really impinge so much on us. However, as both Ambassador and Ambassador Kant and Arvind have pointed out, that the realistic tone emerges from the fact that we would like to see outcomes from these conferences. And therefore, our proposals, our suggestions, more shaped by the possibilities. And what can now gaining strength, we see more and more opportunities opening up. This is a committed group, and I think the historical juncture at which we are, where we are on the cusp of defining the norms and the institutions that are going to shape the 21st century, require informed, reasoned, and far-sighted debates as to what needs to be done, what is the need of the hour. So with that, I'll stop the discussion at this point and open the floor for Q&A and observations, comments. Maybe somebody can read out the questions if they have come in the chat box, or you can simply lift up your hand and we can go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. It was indeed a thought-provoking session, and I think that it has given us all a lot to ponder upon. So we have one question in the chat box from Mr. Barshan Karmarkar. His question is to Professor Anuradha Chenoy. He says, as we know that Russia is a strategic and a security partner of both India as well as China. So in case of a security competition or a clash between India and China in the future, what will be Russia's stand as a strategic buffer, and will the idea behind the trilateralism of the RIC be relevant to ease tensions or bring a resolution in conflicts between India and China?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. It's on the broader strategic interests and the unresolved issues which keep sparking off between India and China and Russia's role. You see, even in the past, if we want to go from past evidence, so far Russia has broadly kept out of China-India, Sino-India conflict, but they have generally they have tried to get both sides to de-escalate. There have been times when it has been stated that they have actually spoken on behalf of India also. They are very keen as was evidence in this conference also. And they were very happy that there had been some engagements between the two sides before the SCO conference. When the Chinese foreign minister came here, they had noted that, and they said it in the conference that they were very happy to see. But you see, India also has this position now that Russia has become extremely close to China, and that was evident at multiple levels. But I don't think it's at the cost of India. And you will see that when Mr. Putin comes here on the 4th and 5th, just like we have engagements, let's say, with the US, and I don't think Russia felt threatened with that at a time when they were having difficulties with the US. They understand that. So similarly, I think we should also understand that even if Russia and China are close, Russia is not going to go against Indian interests. They want to see India as a balancer actually between Russia and China. They're not fully confident about everything about China's move either. So they want this balance. And that is why they are for a multipolar Asia also. And they want Eurasia to be part of this multipolar Asia also. And I think there has to be, I'm sure there will be at the highest level engagement on this issue with Russia. And Russia is going to continue pushing India and China to find ways of managing this conflict in a way that the competition doesn't become into a conflict. A competition is very natural, so it remains like that. Now, if Ambassador Ashok wants to come in, I'd be very happy if he adds or if he's critical of anything I had to say.
Another point you have made is important, that Russia-China relations have their own dynamics, and India need not feel threatened all the time. Yet, no, I'll strike a note of caution there, because we have seen evolution of China-Russia strategic alignment and linkages in a certain direction, particularly since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and came under greater pressure from the West. So its need for support from China increased considerably, and since February 2022, when it moved into Ukraine, that imperative has expanded quite exponentially, to the extent that the West, accuses China of being a strategic enabler of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, a few things are happening there which cause a degree of concern in New Delhi. One, defense collaboration, including in some very sensitive areas like nuclear weapons, space, are expanding in a manner which results in creation of capacities in China, which we'll have to reckon with. So, and no earlier hesitation that we had witnessed in Russia about not opting for more sophisticated weapon systems for development or collaboration. I think that clearly is a thing of the past. So one on defense and security side, this also includes very sophisticated joint exercises which are taking place between China and Russia. They're working together on developing China's capacity for early warning of incoming nuclear weapons, which in fact feeds into a major shift in China's nuclear doctrine, which is taking place today. So that's one aspect. Second aspect on economic side, there's a hardwiring of collaboration that is taking place. Uh, for instance, you have Power of Siberia one, which was agreed to after 2014, and now agreement in principle on Power of Siberia 2. So these linkages, these dependencies that are you may well call interdependencies, which are created, they cannot be reversed easily, especially given Russia's problems with the West. So in many ways, Russia China relationship is becoming somewhat unequal. Russia is always sensitive about its own, independence, its own agency, its own destiny. But equation is changing to an extent where in some future, conflict involving India and China, there will be some question marks about how far Russia will be inclined to provide real-time support to India. So this is a space we need to watch carefully without being paranoid about it, because we cannot make development of our relations with Russia conditional on Russia sort of, in a way, exercising greater degree of caution in developing its ties with China, that they will not accept any such conditionality or advice from us. So no point going down that road. Yet we must monitor it very closely.
Thank you, Ambassador Kanta. Professor Chenoy. We have another question from Mr. Shriyansh Mohanty. He is a research assistant here at ICS. He thanks you for the enlightening discussion on a grouping that gains attention every time Trump decides to target any one of the three countries. He has two questions. Firstly, given the ideological and geopolitical differences among Russia, India, and China, how cohesive and effective is the RIC as a collective actor in shaping outcomes related to the Israel-Iran conflict and wider Middle Eastern peace? Secondly, can the RIC's involvement in the Israel-Iran conflict or the broader Middle East or West Asia be seen as part of a strategic attempt to counter US and Western influence in the region? And if so, what are the implications for global power dynamics? He would like to know the perspective of all the three panelists.
So we can begin with Alka, maybe because she hasn't spoken.
Sorry, I was muted. I was just saying that, Shriyansh, these are huge questions. I think it may not be possible to really address it in any comprehensive or any substantial manner. But it's interesting that the elephant in the room has at these RIC academic discussions has always been the US. And one reason why the scholars at all these conferences have consistently iterated this one plank, that this is not any attempt at making an axis or an alliance targeted at anybody, because all the three countries have very, very substantial interests vis-a-vis the US. And the Chinese participants, in fact, each one of them in turn reiterated that this was their argument was not against the US, but it was against the unilateralism that the US was doing, or the flouting of international norms that the US was engaged in, and the completely unjust manner in which obviously bullying and hegemonism came up quite a bit. The Russians, on their part, also spoke about how the US was bulldozing countries right, left, and center. And so this attitude of unilateral bullying tactics, hegemonism, was very much a part of the Russians and the Chinese discourse. And even I think it came up in the presentations of the Indian scholars that we need to have a rule-based system which is upheld. So, so that was very much clear. But the other point which has been highlighted, and I think it can come in again once the others step in, that when we started to actually look closely at the convergences, we found that while there was a broad agreement about the need for values, the need for moving towards multipolarity, the need for cooperation, the need to focus and prioritize developmental concerns, and how to push for our rights as developing countries at a time when many of these international regimes are trying to stifle the growth process. And these kind of things came up over and over again. But specific issues of cooperation which require a convergence of a very different kind. I mean, for instance, on the Israel-Gaza conflict, or even the Ukraine one, it was obvious that this was not a realm in which scholars were either persuaded of the need to enter, because this is clearly the realm of the policymakers. However, what could be the possible convergences of a Russia, India, China cooperative move to address issues of international peace and conflict was something that did come up, and therefore that will require further deliberation. But I will request Anuradha and Ambassador Kant to come in here.
So I think directly on the two questions, on the international level, very often in the United Nations, when these issues come up of, let's say, Iran, Palestine, Israel, I think Russia, India, and China very skillfully and very often are on the same side without actual coordination. That's one thing. Secondly, now we can see that as far as a state is concerned, China is increasingly a factor in Middle East or West Asian, as we call it, issues. And their engagement with trying to patch up Saudi Arabia-Iran relations was one indication, which on a peace platform was one indication. And then when Israel bombed and followed by American bombing of Iran, Russia and China took pretty strong positions. India took a position of, there should be peace and de-escalation, but these two countries have some kind of strategic agreement with Iran, especially Russia, that has provided them with some amount of defensive technologies. And I think they would continue to do so because for Russia, West Asia, I prefer to call it that, is part of their region. They're a regional part of this area. They extend over there. And India has an interest in the international corridor, international security, corridor, and stakes in that, and it's put in a lot of money in that. So they would like peace in this region, but at the same time, I think the Indian position is they're negotiating this very sensitive tariff agreement with the US, so they can't be too strident. This is how I look at it. So the RIC's involvement in Iran-Israel conflicts is not as RIC. It's an individual initiative of each, though there seems to be some amount of coordination between the Russians and Chinese, but not with the Indians on this. So I'd hand it over to the Ambassador Ashok now for this.
Yeah, thank you, Manrada. I would like to make two additional points there. Uh, One, when it comes to how to deal with the USA, as Alka mentioned, you made it very clear that opposition to USA or countering the USA cannot be the strategic glue binding three countries together or a strategic rationale for RIC as a platform. Yet, we also noticed that it's these three countries, India, China, and Russia, which have been able to stand up to pressures from the USA in their own respective ways. So they have not quite succumbed to those pressures, which is not surprising, given the fact that these are countries that are, as Alka put it, civilizational states. They pursue, independent foreign policy. That's something they own agency, they privilege. That's one. Second point, I think, which is not, which didn't get discussed, reflected in deliberations in Beijing, but should be considered carefully, that the US role itself vis-a-vis its strategic contestation with both China and Russia is undergoing a change. And when it comes to Trump's China policy, there is strategic ambiguity. In fact, he's not repeating positions he had taken in his first administration of treating China as a strategic challenge or competitor. Focuses more on economic, technological rivalry. Likewise, when it comes to Russia, again, despite uh, setbacks, Trump has continued to pursue the position of seeking progress movement towards more normal relations with Russia. There is no inclination to double down on isolating Russia or sanctioning Russia, as we had witnessed during the Biden administration. In fact, one can go to the extent of saying that the policy of dual containment, where USA was simultaneously seeking to contain both China and Russia, is not in evidence at present. Now, this creates a very different dynamics. These are still uncertain times, but if you look at the 28-point proposal that was given by USA to Ukraine, though later it was changed, actually reflected the Russian interests, sensitivities, and positions to a great extent. So this is one area I think we need to watch very carefully because outcomes are still uncertain and we shouldn't be caught on the wrong foot.
Arvind, you want to add?
Thanks, Ashok. Yeah, I was just about to, I was muted. Arvind, you want to chip in here?
Nothing substantial. As most of my mentors, teachers said correctly, RIC is an evolving platform to come and discuss. It is not a block which would collectively, antagonize anything or maybe react to something. This is coming. So, and then just clubbing it, saying that it's just Trump, and so that we should react or we should not react. I think that is too. It is actually too ambiguous to speak on. Point on Middle East Palestine thing is same. the RIC dialogue, or maybe before that also, it happened not just because there was Trump or there was no Trump. So we are looking beyond that dispensation, and I think that is the reality. Okay.
Right. It's time, I think, for just one maybe last question, if there is any.
I cannot see any further question in the chat box, but I do have one question which I would like to ask, if you may.
Sure, certainly, of
Oh,
course. Go ahead.
okay, so as already noted by the panelists, that the ties between India and China continues to remain a weak arm in the RIC grouping. Be it China's insistence of calling Arunachal Pradesh as a part of South Tibet, or the continued Chinese military infrastructure build-up near the border. But besides that, I also understand that it has been highlighted again and again that the alliance is not targeted towards any third country. However, given the fundamental membership of this grouping, how does the US in particular and the West in general view the RIC? Are they threatened by the regional grouping which seek to push for multipolarity, or do they take it just as a symbolic grouping bereft of any real consequence?
Okay, maybe we can have very short responses. Anu, would you like to go in first?
Yeah, thank you, Avni. But I think you should be careful in the kind of languages because these countries are sensitive. RIC is not a grouping. You should call it a platform or a dialogue forum because that's what it is. You know, they don't coordinate their strategies, but the conversations within it are definitely important. And your question whether the West, how the West sees it, the West definitely would see it as a possible emerging threat, and that is why RIC is very careful to continuously say that it is just a forum for dialogue, that it is not an alliance, that it is not anti the West. But the West does see it because there's also the BRICS. And you can see that is the reason why President Trump put 10% additional tariffs on any country which would even become a member of BRICS. And now if you see they've targeted South Africa by boycotting the G20, they're targeting Brazil. They've got this 50% tariffs against India. So that special targeting, if you want to call it that, is against BRICS countries. I think there's clear evidence for that. So they do, they're very cautious. They see like they have 5-year plans for their threat perceptions. And maybe they feel that in 5 years, this could be a threat and they would like to use ways of, either threatening or co-opting or diluting RICS and BRICS, even if RICS is not a formal platform. So they are watching at least a formal RICS processes, and they would watch if there's another foreign ministers meeting of the RICS. Earlier, they were pretty quiet about the BRICS, but under Trump's this term, there is an increasing awareness because of the material basis of BRICS, their collective, per capita and PPP and GDPs and population and various factors. So that's where it is, but we have to keep following this very closely as it all unfolds, because there are also contradictions within the RICS, which the West would like to expand in their own favor. But I think all these three countries are strategically quite mature and careful of how they would move ahead without alienating the US. All three have dialogues with the US. And at the same time, represent views of the global South, and at the same time, have some leverage with each other and between each other also. And that's how I see it. Thank you.
Thanks, Anu.
Yeah. If I could just, I agree with what Anuradha said. if I could just add, one point and reiterate one point Professor Chinoy made. Uh, the visual which came out from Tianjin, uh, though that was not really a meeting of three leaders, Prime Minister Modi, President Xi, and President Putin, it resonated quite strongly in the West. It was taken note of to the extent that immediately after that visual came out, President Trump himself posted on Truth Social, taking note of these three countries coming together. Yet, I suspect serious, observers and policymakers in the West do recognize the fact that RIC, as it stands, doesn't have the requisite strategic convergence uh, or no even instrumentality in terms of being a platform, being a grouping, as Anuradha rightly pointed out, to cause serious discomfiture to Western countries. So I think this is perhaps recognized. So this differentiation, the point I would like to reiterate, is very important observation Professor Chenoy made. West is differentiating between BRICS Plus and RIC. BRICS Plus is causing greater anxieties because it's coming up with some specific ideas and initiatives which might impact US dominance in financial sector. The talk of BRICS currency, though, is pie in the sky. Talk of de-dollarization is leading to a very strong pushback from President Trump himself, because that is something, if it makes progress, will impact USA in particular. RIC, so far, they don't see a corresponding threat. So it's not causing that kind of concern as of now.
Thanks, Ashok. Arvind?
Not too much of divergences before what Ambassador and Anamam said. So one thing is very important here. You see that while RIC is being academic forum is being convened, three parties are talking about how to deal with these emerging challenges. The US has been adapting to this and has been developing its own relationship and scaling up its own engagement, though it is levying higher amount of tariffs against Russia, China, and India, but it keeps on engaging with them, right? So one has to look at that from a strategic angle, that despite being a target or maybe being criticized by other countries, how US comes out of it and takes a position. That's one important thing. Secondly is over a period of time, all these three economies are transitioning. I give you example of the recent G20, where US took a position of banning a country out of G20, and then the position Russia and China and India has taken are different than each other. It was G20 when India held, it invited African Union to be part of it. China had a different opinion on that, right? So while these three countries are talking in this format, academically, the positions are not to intersect or to essentially find convergences. It is to bring it to a point where we can have a dialogue and reiterate and put forward the point and position we have taken. So I think it is not that whether US is seeing it anti-West or anti-US or anti-Europe. I don't see it. US has been pretty calibrative, when it looks at these things happening. As ambassadors correctly, within BRICS, when BRICS was expanded, Brazil definitely is not happy. Brazil thought that it has lost the premium. telling the rest of the Latin American country that it is a part of that club, exclusive part of that club. It is not happy with that. So within these groupings, within these frameworks, there are certain kind of uneasiness. US and West knows this very carefully. So they're clever of not making a conclusive statement on these forums.
Arvind, I think very comprehensively addressed that whole point about the RIC and the West. I'll just make 2 points here. I think when we are looking at it from the point of view of, say, an academic or a scholarly exercise, clearly looking at the West as one consolidated bloc, which is thinking in a very uniform manner about these 3 major players, India, China, and Russia, is not there. There's no such thing as a West anymore. What we are probably looking at is how the US is responding to what is clearly an impending shift in the structural systemic order that so far we have seen. Now, as Arvind says, that the US itself is now building up its own defenses, it's reaching out in different ways. But clearly here, the main target is China, which is going to be the most significant challenge to US dominance. And you can see how the United States is calibrating its approach in different ways, reaching out to all 3 countries. So with regard to Europe, which is the other side of the coin, we see again very different approaches. They have different threat perceptions vis-a-vis Russia, very different kind of a dilemma vis-a-vis China, and they are dealing with India in a different way. That's one part of the story, that China is really the focus of the current consternation in the larger Western camp, which is largely dominated by the US, and you can see the kind of differences that is happening there. And the other side of the coin is how the greater transformation of what is collectively called, for convenience, the global South, the emergence of middle powers, the emergence of emerging powers, the newer institutions, the dynamism that we are seeing in what were very smaller countries so far, or the swing kind of role that many countries are able to play in this current. So all this is making the need to study the trends very, very clearly. I do not think that at this point, even the scholars can authoritatively make a point about how RIC will lead this or that, or how RIC will come together on this or that, because the convergences and the divergences still have to be spelled out in terms of categorical interests which are bringing them together. Talking in terms of principles, and therefore the significance of RIC as civilizational states with a long historical trajectory, with very, very different approaches to international relations, the norms and the values that should undergird these things. These are the things which scholars have to bring out, which come from very unique, different perspectives of RIC. And I think in a very, very fundamental sense, that is the true challenge to the Western-dominated international system of the last 3 centuries. There, I think, as scholars, we feel the need to now look at the last 3 centuries in its proper historical perspective and see where India, China, and Russia can contribute to that shift of the underpinnings of international relations. So I'll thank my fellow panelists here. It has been a great conversation. I hope our viewers have enjoyed it and benefited from it as much. And I will now hand over with the request that please bring this session to a close.
Yes, we come to an end to today's seminar. We thank Professor Alka Acharya and the esteemed panelists, Professor Anuradha Chinoy, Ambassador Ashok Kanda, and Dr. Arvind Yelleri for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. we would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website.